Hello, friends, and welcome to The Membership, a podcast about the life and work of Wendell Berry, the Kentucky farmer, poet, novelist, essayist, and activist. My name is Jason Hardy, and I'm joined by two fellow members.
This is Tim Wassam.
And this is John Pattison.
So today, we are continuing with Wendell Berry's short fiction, continuing in chronological order. We are up to, is it 1912?
Yeah,
Is that right?
We're in the
in Port William time.
We're in the 1910s.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah.
1912.
And we're talking about the relatively long short story "Pray Without Ceasing." This was originally published in the Southern Review, but it was also published in the short story collection called Fidelity. This was the, as I mentioned in our Zero episode, this is the first short story that I ever read of Wendell Berry's, and actually the first Wendell Berry fiction that I ever read. So it holds a special place in my heart. Had you guys read this story before?
Yeah, I think this is I read it a couple times before, but it had been, 3 or 4 years since I had read it last. So I was happy to read it again, for sure.
That's basically the same for me. It's been I've read it before, but it's been a few years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
This is a story, I talked about Jayber Crow being a novel where I remembered where I was when I was reading it. This is actually a story that I remember where I was when I was reading it, like you, but I was sitting... The first time I read it, my parents were still in town. They were working at the seminary. My dad was working at the seminary in town, and I was sitting just kind of in this big, beautiful room outside of his office that had a fireplace going, sitting in a big leather chair, and I remember it being like a pretty great experience reading this collection. It was actually from Fidelity when I first read it as well, that I had borrowed from my father-in-law.
Yeah.
Jason, do you remember where you were specifically when you read it?
Oh yeah, this is the story I read when I was sitting in the library. At Belmont. Yeah.
When your dorm room was made uninhabitable as you said.
Exactly. Yeah. So I was just hanging out in the library, pulled down Fidelity, and started, and that was it was the first thing. Come to think of it, it was the first piece of writing by Wendell Berry, period, that I read. So.
And you thought, in 10 years, I'm going to start a podcast.
I'm going to start a podcast about this guy. Yeah, exactly. Well, I'll give a little bit of a synopsis for readers who maybe haven't read it, or listeners who haven't read it, or for whom it's been a while. This is a story that's sort of a story within a story. There's a frame narrative. Andy Catlett, who is... by all accounts, Wendell Berry's representative in Port William. He is the character who most resembles Wendell Berry. He comes across a newspaper clipping from 1912 about the murder of his great-grandfather, Ben Coulter. And he decides that he needs to go... Sorry, I said Ben Coulter. It's Ben Feltner. Thank you, Tim, for pointing to my notes.
I would imagine that's not the first time that's going to happen.
Right. There's lots of Coulters and lots of Feltners. Yeah.
Say there's only 4 last names in Wendell Berry's fiction.
Right, exactly. It's easy to mix them up. Yeah. And Andy Catlett, we come to find out is a Feltner and a Coulter. He has Feltners and Coulters in his family tree. So, and that's part of the beauty of the story. But Ben Feltner, Andy Catlett's great-grandfather, was murdered by Thad Coulter, who was a friend of Ben Feltner's. And Andy Catlett goes to see his grandfather, Matt Feltner, and his grandmother. And his grandmother ends up telling him the full story, which he's never really heard before, about how Ben Feltner was murdered. So I think a good place to start would be maybe to talk about that frame narrative and maybe some of the text we have in that frame narrative. The story starts out with sort of I was joking with Tim before we started, a T.S. Eliot-esque meditation on time and eternity. And I wondered what you guys thought about that. I'll read just a paragraph from that. Andy Catlett starts out by talking about how, he recognizes that he is affected by the past of his family and his community, even if he doesn't know what that past is. So I'll start reading here. But even the unknown past is present in us, its silence as persistent as a ringing in the ears. When I stand in the road that passes through Port William, I am standing on the strata of my history that go down through the known past into the unknown. The blacktop rests on state gravel, which rests on county gravel, which rests on the creek rock and cinders laid down by the town when it was still mostly beyond the reach of the county. And under the creek rock and cinders is the dirt track of the town's beginning, the buffalo trace that was the way we came. You work your way into the interior of the present until you finally come to that beginning in which all things, the world and the light itself, at a word, welled up into being out of their absence. And nothing is here that we are beyond the reach of merely because we do not know about it. It is always the first morning of creation and always the last day. Always the now that is in time and the now that is not, that has filled time with reminders of itself. So, what do you guys think is going on there? Why have this meditation at the beginning of this particular story?
I think, and I'm speaking in a bit of a generality that I don't know if I can back up completely, but at least it's like a gut feeling that Wendell Berry has a tendency to set up a story by explaining kind of on the by coming at it from the periphery of why it's an important story to him, or like why it's a meaningful story. I think that comes out, or maybe even what I'm thinking of is how he approaches his essays. But I think he's setting it up with almost a little bit of a sermon of sorts, or a little bit of a mini essay that he's approaching, saying that, kind of putting in context once again his attitude towards his place and his attitude towards how he sees, and I use this phrase a lot, but how he sees an infinity within the small place where he is. The first morning of creation and always the last day, and this is without even leaving home. So I guess I don't know if that answer makes any sense, but that's just, I feel like he's giving us a sort of foundation on which to lay this story.
Yeah, I love what he does. You're right that this is not an unusual approach for him, but I found myself just really loving the way that the story itself is kind of a meditation on time and how what's past is present. And that's something he touches on a lot at the beginning, but comes back to it at the end as well. Even, talking about how he remembers his grandfather's, the touch of his hand on his knee, and that past action is as present to him now as it was then. And he says the same thing about later when his grandmother touches his hand.
Right. Like leaves an imprint on his
leaves an imprint. Mm-hmm. And this is, we know that Andy Catlett is sort of the memory keeper. He's the memory keeper for Port William, or one of the memory keepers. And I can't help but picture this character who is walking through his town of Port William, and the streets that he's walking down are peopled with ghosts almost, who are alive to him because he knows and cherishes and safeguards these memories.
Yeah, I think that to go right along with that, I feel like the crux of that whole introduction, that whole space, is that line that you referenced, the past is present in us, its silence as persistent as a ringing in the ears. I think that the reason he's starting out by saying this is he's setting up this idea that this story, the silence from this story, what he didn't know about his great-grandfather, has been ringing in his ears his whole life, and now he's at that point in life where his grandfather is literally in bed, sick, near the end of his life. His grandmother, it almost seems at the beginning of the story that he's not even really sure how much his grandmother knows, because they have this tendency to keep things from her a little bit. And so he's saying, here's a story I'm going to tell you it's the absence of this story has been ringing in my ears my whole life, and now it's time to figure it out.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's right.
Thank you.
Yes. Of course. Good job, Tim.
Thank you.
You passed.
Right. Good night, everybody.
You passed. Talking about, John, what you said about Andy Catlett being the memory keeper, or one of the memory keepers for Port William, it stood out to me that he gets that not from his grandfather, not from Matt Feltner, because Matt Feltner has never told him this story, has never talked about this story. It is from his grandmother, who, that he hears this story.
Yeah. he definitely sets you up to think it's going to be his grandfather. Mm-hmm. But then before he even gets the chance to ask, that's what's so interesting.
Yeah. I mean, and it even says that this story has been kept by not just his grandmother, but by the women who were there, right? It says she told the story well, giving many details. She had a good memory, and she had lived many years with her mother-in-law, who had also had a good one. I have the impression that they, but not my grandfather, had pondered together over the event many times. She spoke as if she were seeing it all happen, even the parts of it that she had not, in fact, not seen.
So that we'll get to this later, but that's because all the men of the town were out with pitchforks,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly.
Where just the people who were the most present are the ones who were there to care.
Yeah,
so that's great.
So, I mean, at the heart of this story is an act of violence. This is about as violent as a Wendell Berry story gets, right? Thad Coulter, we're told, in, I mean, relatively graphic detail, shoots Ben Feltner in the head. I guess we should give a little bit more background about why he did this. Mm-hmm. Thad Coulter is a friend to Ben Feltner. Ben Feltner is older, I think we're told, than Thad, but he's helped him along the way, sort of been an older friend and almost a mentor to Thad Coulter in his life. And Thad Coulter's son, Abner, essentially signed a loan for Thad to open up a grocery store in the nearby town of Hargrave. And
his farm was collateral.
Yeah, using his farm as collateral, which he had just paid off. And Thad's son Abner essentially fritters the money away and loses his store and just runs away, rides out of town, doesn't come back, and the bank comes calling to Thad and is collecting money, coming to collect the farm essentially, to take the farm from him because his son is defaulting on this loan. So Thad goes home, is distraught, gets drunk, then decides to go see his friend Ben and ask him if he can help in some way. But he's drunk and combative, and Ben tells him, you know what, I can't talk to you right now. Why don't you come back later? And this makes him angry. He takes it poorly, takes it as a complete rejection, which it absolutely isn't.
It's a very gentle. Yeah, I mean everything about Ben's reaction to him is very measured,
sure,
gentle.
Yeah,
not abrasive at all. He's just kind of like, why don't you come back and talk to me later?
Yeah. And so Ben goes into town and tries to find some of Thad's relatives. Dave Coulter, his who is it? Is it his
Burley's dad?
Cousin, but it's Burley Coulter's dad. And he starts talking to them and trying to get them to help. And they're just about to start formulating a plan, it seems like, to help Thad out of his trouble. And
Ben even alludes to, there's something we can do, but let's talk about it. Like
right.
he already has a plan in his head somewhere.
Yeah, and then Thad comes riding into town with a gun, and he's so drunk and angry and hurt that he shoots Ben in the head. So yeah, at the heart of this story is an act of violence. What role do you guys think violence plays in this story, and more than that, the human instinct towards violence?
Well, there are a few different places in which Thad and even Matt are described as being almost joyful with the intent to commit violence.
Yeah,
and that was really striking for me. Both, Thad was described as either being joyful or feeling elated when he had resolved in his drunkenness to kill Ben. And then later, Matt Feltner, after he sees that Thad has done this, he is described as being either joyful or elated because of his intent to exact revenge. And so, that was... I think it's all about the human will is not the right word, but the propensity toward violence. I mean, he says at the beginning, he says this is a story that goes back to Cain and Abel. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was, and while I obviously, and the listeners will be grateful to know this, while I have never committed murder, while I have never been murderous, I have experienced rage in which I felt almost elated in my rage. Mm-hmm. and righteous in my rage. And so I found myself even very much identifying with Thad's character. Though I am not and will never be a murderer,
Yeah.
I still see him. And it reminds me of what Andy Catlett's grandmother says when she's beginning to tell the story, that Thad was a little child, and that we're all little children. And some people know it and some don't, which of course reminds us of Burley's statement about being members, of how some people know it and some people don't. But that we're all little children, and that some know it and some don't. And Andy admits that at 30 years old, hearing the story for the first time, he didn't know it yet. But I found Thad, I found him not only compelling but even relatable.
Sure. Yeah, we're told he's not a bad man. Like even Andy's grandmother, Margaret, who is telling Andy the story, tells him Thad wasn't a bad man.
That's right. Leading into the comment about we're all children.
Yeah.
Right. That's all. Yeah.
Like we all have this instinct within us. It's whether or not we're aware of it and able to counter it with something more human. I mean, I think this leads up to what I think is the climax of the story, which is the wrestling match between Jack Beecham and Matt Feltner. But I want to read just the part before that after Ben is killed, we're told that the story sort of shifts to Matt, his son's perspective. He's in town. He's at the blacksmith shop. And someone tells him, or he sees that something is going on, so he walks out and sees that it's his father who's been killed. And I'll read a little bit from it there. When Matt stood up again from his father's side, he was a man new created by rage. All that he had been and thought and done gave way to this one desire to kill the man who had killed his father. He ached, mind and body, with the elation of that one thought. And in that thought, I'm skipping ahead a little bit. And in that thought, which lived more in his right arm than in his head, both he and his enemy were as clear of history as if newborn. I really like that because I think this maybe ties back to that opening section about time and eternity, and that your connectedness to what has come before and what will come after you.
And maybe and maybe a connection to like, we can be right back at the beginning of creation again any minute.
Yeah.
Like for each of us. Like at some point something can trigger you off and you're back to Cain and Abel all of a sudden.
Well, and with Barry's sort of antipathy toward any kind of abstraction, that strikes me as what he's saying is that instinct towards violence is an instinct towards an abstraction that refuses to see your place in history or your place in a chain of consequences. It's just if you follow that path, you're removed from your place and your relation to other people. But right after this, we're told that Jack Beecham, Matt's uncle, Margaret's brother, Nancy's brother, sees the commotion. Someone tells him, "Hey, this is your nephew out here. They've killed Ben." And he runs out of the shop that he's in and sees Matt running after Thad Coulter and essentially tackles him. And there's sort of this wrestling match between the two of them. And we're told that eventually Matt settles down and Jack feels like something is taken out of him and goes into Matt. And I'll read a little bit from that. What went out of Jack and came into Matt, or so it seemed, for in that desperate embrace he became a stronger man than he had been. A strength came into him that held his grief and his anger as Jack had held him. I think that's beautiful.
And so well connected to the rest of the stories of Port William when you think about, which this is far away from us talking about, but the memory of old Jack. When we talk about him in that book in his old age, he seems like a sort of brittle old little man, like a little old man, And at this point, I think, and if I remember right, he even makes Andy makes a point to mention that Jack still had strength in him, even though he was already like getting along in age. That he still had this sort of vitality to him and this strength.
Right.
It's a great connection.
I mean, it's sort of a different kind of strength, right? We're told that Matt is, about half Jack's age, and yet he's able to, this strength leaves Jack and comes into Matt, and this strength is what allows him to take a step back and move away from his instinct towards violence, which is, to me, the center of the story.
And this is one of the most memorable scenes in all of Wendell Berry's fiction for me. I think about this scene quite a lot, actually. I don't even know why, but the thought of these two, like, of one man essentially like bear hugging another, keeping him immobile, and feeling something go out of him as a result of this struggle is just so beautifully written and just masterful. How's that for trenchant analysis?
Yeah, well, it's the hinge from Jack going from manhood to his elder years or his elderly life, and then it's the hinge between, or the turn from Matt going from being a boy to being a man, kind of.
It's great.
Which pays off a little later in the story, which we'll get to.
A
little later. That the moment with Jack is essentially the setup for the payoff that comes just a little bit later, when people are beginning to look for a solution or beginning to try to figure out what to do with everything that's happened. That was intentionally very vague because I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. But
well, so I mean, I think we've already sort of started to mention this, but I feel like this is one of the more overtly Christian stories in the Wendell Berry canon. There's so many references, like to Cain and Abel, the title, Pray Without Ceasing. We have the word that created in the beginning. What do y'all make of the religious sort of overtones to this story?
Feels like a story divided kind of straight down the middle, where you've got sort of the gritty reality of what's happening, and then there's not like a religious well, I mean, in some ways there is, but when I read it this time, I didn't focus on like the religious explanation for what's happening, but rather the religious way that people handle the aftermath of what happened, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So in some ways it feels like a very real kind of gritty story, where it was super interesting to me the way that the Hargrave sheriff talks about Port William as being this like Wild West that's off there. It's like, I wish you guys would just stay over there and kill yourselves over there, like kill each other over there or whatever. That it's in that sense that it's very human, and Port William seems like this weird little cut off community where all these crazy things happen and people are messing with each other, and sometimes people die and sometimes people take care of each other. So in that sense it doesn't feel very religious, but I think the religious part of it, and maybe unintentionally, the divide is that the religion comes from the females in the story. Right. And the sort of human conflict and mess comes from the male side of the story, because we get told in the line, Pray Without Ceasing comes from, somebody's going to remind me what the name. Who says that?
Oh, it's Paul.
Della.
Paul. Yeah, it's Miss Della. I thought you were saying,
Della,
where did it come from originally?
Yeah.
It's like
St. Paul. Thanks, Jason. Yeah. Oh, the Bible.
Bible.
No, the character in the story who brings it up.
Yeah.
Just that even her.
Yeah, I mean, I love that title for this because of we are all as little children. Bramer Hardy in the beginning says something like, "There's no telling what a human being is going to do. There's no way to know."
Yeah.
So this idea of praying without ceasing, so that we can be good human beings.
So it'll keep you out of trouble.
Keeping us out of keeping us out of what we know we're all capable of. That seems like a really powerful idea and a really Christian idea. I don't know. I feel like I've been a little in the past few episodes when we've been talking about some of the early nonfiction and early poetry. I think what has struck me about that is Berry's pushing back against institutional religion, but I don't hesitate to call this a Christian story in the best sense of that, right?
And remember too that Andy Catlett, when he thinks of his grandmother sitting there in her rocking chair, though he had never heard her pray, he assumes that what she's doing is she just sits
praying,
there day after day is praying, essentially praying without ceasing.
It is when you think about just that passage of Pray Without Ceasing, and it's a very Christian story in its themes, but at the same time, it's not, for lack of a better way to describe it, Jesus. Oh yeah, it's definitely it's framed in a way that's the passage that's used and the way that it's talked about makes it seem very sort of just like simple baseline moral human being. Like, how do you handle something like this, and how do you treat one another, and even praying without ceasing. That I think to the characters in this, I don't think everybody in this, and I don't even think Matt necessarily is this super pious, I'm going to drop to my knees and pray without ceasing about this, but like even just that phrase is able to translate into his own version of it or something.
Yeah.
Right? How he's going to handle it. He's like, I see what you're saying. And for him, this praying without ceasing idea is just like, I'm not gonna let myself fall into what's about to happen in front of me. And this is what I was referring to earlier, where the sort of vigilante group of men come up to the house, ready to find justice. That phrase itself, "pray without ceasing," is enough for him to say, like, there's something better to do in this situation than what you guys want to do.
Right.
Such as pray, or such as just stay put for a second and just chill. So
Yeah.
And if you go back and look at the context for that verse in 1 Thessalonians 5, pray without ceasing is in verse 16, but if you go up a little bit, you see that Paul is sort of giving his final instructions to the Thessalonians, and he says, leading up to that, be at peace among yourselves. And we urge you, brothers, admonish the idle, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, be patient with them all. See that no one repays anyone evil for evil, but always seek to do good to one another and to everyone. Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you.
And that's the Bible, right? Just kidding. Yeah. No, that's great, and that it opens up the story a little bit when you hear all that together, and it kind of explains evil for evil.
Be at peace, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Be patient, help the weak, and help the weak. That's Thad Coulter's daughter, caring for her father, even as when he's drunk, caring for him when he's in jail. It's Jack Beecham caring for Matt Feltner.
I love
it's
the
Ben
line.
Feltner caring for Thad.
Yeah,
for sure. I love the line that this is about Thad's relationship with his daughter, and it says that he said that her concern gives him shelter, or something along those lines. That kind of applies to all those relationships. That the concern or the care of them is in itself a shelter from the storm.
Well, let me read along those lines. Let me read, if you'll indulge me, my favorite passage from the book. This is Margaret Feltner talking, Andy's grandmother talking to him. People sometimes talk of God's love as if it's a pleasant thing, but it is terrible in a way. Think of all it includes. It included Thad Coulter, drunk and mean and foolish, before he killed Mr. Feltner, and it included him afterwards. She reached out then and touched the back of my right hand with her fingers. My hand still bears that touch, invisible and yet indelible as a tattoo. That's what Thad saw. This is another quote, her talking again. That's what Thad saw. He saw his guilt. He had killed his friend. He had done what he couldn't undo. He had destroyed what he couldn't make. But in the same moment, he saw his guilt included in the love that stood as near him as Martha Elizabeth, and at that moment wore her flesh. It was surely weak and wrong of him to kill himself, to sit in judgment that way over himself. But surely God's love includes people who can't bear it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's beautiful.
Gosh, it's a lot to think about with those lines.
Yeah.
With the talk of suicide, and to read that again. It was that it would include. Where is it? It was surely weak and wrong of him to kill himself, to sit in judgment that way over himself, but surely God's love includes people who can't bear it. It's so heartbreaking, those scenes where Thad's in jail.
Yeah.
And he literally won't take his hands off of his face, covering his face with his hands, and Martha Elizabeth is literally like scooping up food and like trying to get it between his hands and like into his mouth and giving him a little sip of water. He barely lets her give anything, but he won't even let her look at him.
Yeah.
For days, right? For 2 days almost, or 8, day and a half or something like that. It's heartbreaking because we basically one part of the story we haven't really referred to is that after he kills him, he gets onto his mule. He's rolling out of town. He kind of hides in the brush and basically goes straight for. And we get to see his process of sobering up, kind of.
Yeah.
We see him go from this drunk who just killed. And another great line we haven't referenced yet is that he says that I just killed the best friend I ever had.
Yeah.
Is what he ends up telling the sheriff at Hargrave. But we see him in his process of sobering up to the point where he gets to Hargrave and he decides, well, I've got nothing to do but turn myself in.
Yeah.
Oh, gosh. And it's just, you can feel the weight of it
Yeah.
on him and eventually Martha, who walks
And then you
there,
have-
right? Yeah.
Yeah. And then you have Margaret Feltner saying to Andy, like the implications of that kind of love when she says, if God loves the ones we can't, then finally maybe we can. And she says, all these years I've thought of him, meaning Thad Coulter, sitting in those shadows with Martha Elizabeth standing beside him and his work-sore old hands over his face.
So we've got to talk about we've been alluding to it. We've got to talk about the end of the story. So Tim, you want to walk us through the end of the story?
Yeah, absolutely. So after the wrestling match between Jack and Matt that happens, he sends his who comes back to the house.
Matt comes back to the house and tells his mother what has happened,
Sorry.
and Jack brings the body.
Yeah, so yeah, I sort of conflated another character in there for some reason on this last reading. But so Matt comes back to share the news, and so he basically sets it up so that everybody else leaves the room. But we get this sense that Margaret knew exactly what was coming based on, I guess, his demeanor, and knows what to expect. And once he tells her, she immediately her eyes are watering up, but she refuses to go into grieving mode. She doesn't start wailing. She immediately first thinks that we need to clean up the house and get it ready. We need to get the bed ready because they're going to need somewhere to lay his body once Jack brings the body back. And then once the body's brought back, we're told that immediately women from the town start bringing food within short order, within a short amount of time.
And this is when Miss Della comes, brings a cake, and tells Jack, pray without ceasing. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, and so there's a sort of vigil going on or a wake of sorts at their house immediately, as people are helping them as they begin to grieve, and as Jack is out on the porch, and actually I said sitting, he's not sitting. They make a point to say he's not sitting. He's kind of pacing around and standing, and suddenly a group of men from the town sort of start making their way. They can hear them coming, and this group of men come up and say. To Matt, who stands at the top of the steps with his mom standing short ways behind him, we don't agree with what Thad did. It was wrong. We cared about Ben. We love Ben, and we think that we shouldn't wait for the law to do anything about this. We should take it into our own hands, and we're ready to. So just give us the word, and we'll go take care of this. And the way they're going to take care of it is shown by a man deep in the crowd raising his hand and showing an already tied noose in his hand ready to go, that they're basically planning to go force Thad out of the prison in Hargrave and hang him, taking justice into their own hands. But Matt, the previous conversations have set in, and Matt knows that responding to evil with evil is not the path that he or his mother, more importantly, would want. And he tells them to stand down. And so this group then disperses either back to the town or the men in the group whose wives are already there taking care of the family and doing the hard work of being with the people who are grieving, not just reacting to what happened to cause the grief, to which Margaret agrees that is not what they want. And then we're told that Jack finally sits down. He finally stops pacing around and sits, because I guess we can assume that he was all the while worrying that this was going to happen at some point.
Yeah,
Well, doesn't it say that Matt sits and then Jack sits?
Yeah, I think
Maybe,
so.
yeah, okay.
Yeah, because Jack's been waiting just to watch Matt and make sure that he's not going to fall back into wanting to take revenge.
And this is kind of maybe even you could describe it as the final step in whatever transaction happened between them in their wrestling match. This is where it's sort of done and done.
Yeah.
Whatever passed between them, Matt responded in the way that Jack seems to be hoping he would respond.
Yeah.
And I'm wrong. It doesn't say that Matt actually sits there. But you're right. Jack has heard the response that he needs to hear, that there won't be more violence that day, that Matt's life, that Matt's not going to go off and exact vengeance or have others do that work for him. So you were right, Tim.
Okay. And that's it. Even thinking about that feels dramatically, it feels right, because then that leaves Jack sitting back and Matt still standing his ground up at the front of those steps. Right? Mm-hmm. He's still there, and he's basically taken over in their line and taking up what his dad has now been robbed of, right?
Yeah.
And one thing we haven't talked about with his mother is that she's already dressed in black, right? That she's already suffered, is it 2 or 3? 3 children?
I think it's 3.
3 children who've died.
And we're told this in The Hurt Man as well, right? Yeah, this is Nancy, the same lady
Yes.
that she's experienced all of this pain in her life.
Did I say Margaret?
She's maybe.
Okay.
Margaret
Sorry, I'm
is
mixing
no.
up.
It's super confusing. Port William
mixing-
fiction gets super confusing, but Nancy, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think so. Nancy Feltner is Ben's wife. She was Nancy Beecham. She's Jack's sister. Margaret is formerly Margaret Finley, but now she's Margaret Feltner, married to Matt.
Yeah, I
And that's
apologize.
Andy's grandmother.
I think
No,
I've
no,
said
that's
Margaret.
fine.
I think for those listening, I think I've said Margaret a couple times, meaning Nancy. So I apologize for that.
It's confusing.
But yeah, so go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think something you mentioned, and I'd like to talk about this a little bit more, and I do this with trepidation because, again, we have to keep reminding ourselves that we're 3 men talking about this, but the gender roles, I feel like Wendell Berry is playing with gender roles in this last exchange in the story. In a really, really interesting way. Like, on the one hand, you have sort of the stereotypical, like you said, like the women are in a caregiving role, right? And the men are out plotting vigilante justice or their vision of justice, and they're going to go hang this guy. But it's very clear which gender is morally in the right in this story. And it's interesting, we were actually talking about this before we started recording, but the men come and they speak to Matt, right? They ask him what he wants them to do, right? They don't ask Nancy, the widow, right? They assume that Matt is in charge here, and Matt gives his answer, and it's the right answer. But I want to read, Nancy steps up after this as well, and I want to read that section. Nancy, under whose feet the earth was not shaking, if it ever had, stepped up beside her son and took his arm. She said to the crowd, "I know you are my husband's friends. I thank you. I, too, must ask you not to do as you propose. Matt has asked you. I have asked you. If Ben could, he would ask you. Let us make what peace is left for us to make." What do you guys think is going on there with these sort of stereotypical gender roles, but also maybe something else going on there? Or is there something else going on there?
I don't know if there's something else going on besides just the fact that she gets the last word.
Yeah.
I think that she gets the last input, and that I think very clearly Matt's not opposed to that at all. I mean, Matt probably feels out of his element a little bit. He went from a very simple day of going to the blacksmith shop to suddenly having to talk down a mob. And he responds as best he can based on what he's already been told by the women of the house, or the lessons he's already learned. And I don't know. I think we're definitely supposed to walk away from this seeing the strength of her, but also the growth of Matt. So it's like with Nancy, we're supposed to know that she's strong. She's been strong. She's been through more than anybody else in this story. She's dealt with more even than Thad and all of his money problems. Like she's lost more, yet she's the one who doesn't hesitate. She's the one who doesn't even let a tear collect and drop from her eye before she shows her strength and shows her, I guess, righteousness or whatever. I don't think it all feels very appropriate, though.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, even the mob approaching Matt first and addressing Matt, like, of course they would. It's 1911 or 1912 or whatever. Like that's what would have happened. But it also feels very just the way that it wraps up with her chiming in with those words, because she's better spoken than he is in this, because she's the one who's dealt with grief over and over and over and over again.
Yeah.
It's interesting that this is yet another story that ends with a strong female presence in the story, and it is also another story that was written later, right?
Yeah, in the 90s or
Fidelity was a relatively later story, and it's also a later story, or an earlier story in the timeline. We keep talking about this, that the first three short stories that we've talked about have all involved a strong female presence and have all been written later in his career, which is pretty fascinating and
I think
wonderful.
that there's an additional element to that, where all three of these stories have strong women who stare down the violence, or potential violence of the crowd.
Yeah.
Remember in the first story, The Girl in the Window, Wendell talked again and again about the bunches. And then in the second story, The Hurt Man, we actually don't know at first whether the crowd that's running up to the house is a friend of the hurt man, or are there to pursue him and hurt him worse. But you have the female protagonist in that story, standing in their way, so that they can't get through the house to where the hurt man is run. And here you have again a strong female character, Nancy Beecham.
That same strong female character, yeah.
Is it Nancy Beecham?
Yeah,
oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So she's been in this, has been in a similar stance before.
Right. Yeah, and Rebecca Daw is actually in this story as well. Rebecca Finley. After she's married, she shows up to take Bess, Andy Catlett's mother, who's a little girl. She shows up to take her, which is kind of cool to see these stories connecting to one another.
Yeah, so it's you have the strong female characters, and then you have many of the men in the story, in this story, sort of being portrayed within the context of crowds and bunches. There's even a point in this story in which Wendell Berry says the crowd said such and such. He doesn't even bother to designate or to name the individual speaker in the crowd.
Yeah,
it's the crowd said.
He doesn't even show us the face of the person who holds up the noose either. It's just it's just a hand that anonymously bursts out of the crowd. I guess that's the definition of a mob, right?
Right.
They don't have an identity besides the identity of the mob and the mission of the mob, and its arm pops up.
And what sort of disperses it is Matt inviting them to come in and eat with him. Like at the end, and their wives are already inside. You
guys done yet?
Yeah,
yes. Yeah. That is a. We go back to the Christian story. I mean, that's probably the strongest feeling I got throughout the reading, was that moment where he says, "Come, we eat with us." It becomes
I tear up every time I read that. Yeah,
it's a moment of communion. It's a moment of like, just come share a meal with us. That's the only thing that's going to help anyone, is just to eat together.
Yeah. So, I mean, maybe the last thing that I think might be good for us to acknowledge and maybe discuss, and I think we'll probably discuss this off and on as we continue to move through the fiction, is, one of the criticisms that gets made toward Wendell Berry's fiction is that in some way it's too idealistic about rural communities, right? There was an essay that made the rounds on the internet, in Wendell Berry circles on the internet, from it was an essay that was actually published in the publication Plow by Tamara Hill Murphy. The title of it is "The Hole in Wendell Berry's Gospel: Why the Agrarian Dream is Not Enough." And she essentially makes the argument that Wendell Berry's Port William fiction does not consider sort of the underside of agrarian or rural communities. So, I mean, I feel like this story is sort of an interesting test case. I mean, it is a story where Wendell Berry is acknowledging darkness. But I do want to read just a little paragraph from Tamara Hill Murphy's essay and see if you guys think that that this story is a good sort of counter argument to her argument, or if maybe she has a point. She says, the dissonance with Barry occurs when I consider other family tales buried under the agrarian beauty. These are stories of shattered relationships, addiction, job loss, abandonment, mental illness, and unspoken violations that seem to separate my kinfolk from the clans in Port William. Her family came from a rural area in upstate New York, I believe. In Barry's fictional village, readers occasionally witness felonies, infidelity, drunken brawls, and tragic deaths, but all of them seem to be told in a dusky, warming light. What do you guys think about that? Is Pray Without Ceasing sort of a counter argument to that, or do you think she sort of has a point?
My answer is both.
Yeah.
Because I think, in one sense, Wendell stays very true to what Port William is and what kind of town it is. And Port William is a town that's untouched by industry, right? And at this point,
yeah.
And a lot of the factory jobs and these kinds of things that went away that then have led to the job loss and the addiction and all the things that have happened in these rural communities. I don't think this story counters it really in that sense like a Ron Rash story would, which is much more modern, where Ron Rash stories tend to the gritty, where I think he does tend toward the idealistic, but not in a sort of not in a necessarily unfounded way. Because this is a town that is innocent, not just for the sake of being innocent, but for the sake of geographically, it's literally cut off by water and land, and that it hasn't really been touched by, the Hargrave sheriff talking about this place being this weird Wild West where what are they doing over there? Just that kind of attitude. So I think it's a fair point that it's leaving out a large part of the experience of the agrarian life and in these rural communities, but at the same time, I don't think he's avoiding it by design by any stretch of the imagination.
What do you think, John?
When I first read her essay in Plow magazine, I found myself getting really defensive, and Wendell Berry doesn't need me to get defensive on his behalf, and so I read it a couple of times because I realized I needed to give it more careful consideration. I will admit, though, when I was reading this story, her essay came to mind, and I found myself, saying to myself, see, here's this not only tragic, but I think, graphic story, and it's not gritty, but I also don't think I would describe it as being told in a dusky, warming light, even though I guess maybe it is, because it's Margaret Feltner telling it to Andy. Perhaps in dusky, warming light. We're not really told what the temperature of the room is, but to me, this is not a story that is depicted in pastels. I think it's a sad story. I mean, would you say it has a moral or a message? I feel like it comes pretty close to having that, and maybe she is being critical of the way that some of his writing, I guess, steps right up to the edge of being didactic.
Early on in this podcast, I remember telling you guys that at certain times I have that feeling that his fiction, though I love it to death, can approach cheesy for me, and I had said that almost in a Hallmarky way. Not totally. That was just the lazy description I think that I came up with, and I think that maybe that what you just described is what I feel. Combined with what I had said before, though, now what I've grown to understand is that I don't think it's by design. I don't think he's avoiding anything. I think that's just what Port William is. He wants to stay true to that.
Yeah.
So what actually this story brought to mind was the shooting of the children at Nickel Mines, the Amish schoolhouse, where, you had this incredibly tragic, awful event that happened where this deranged, broken man opened fire on these Amish school children, and I can't remember how many he killed, maybe 10 or 11. And the news went around the world, but so did the response of the Amish community to this man's family, where they invited his family to come eat with them and to pray with them, and invited them to the services. And so you have a real world example of a community of people who are choosing not to repay evil for evil, doing their best to forgive in the midst of tragedy. And I don't think that, that's not a pastel story, because it ends in forgiveness and as a story about the power of not returning evil for evil, but rather choosing to love your enemies.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it can't be pastel because it happened, right? Like it's real. Yeah. I mean, I think that, and hopefully we'll be able to talk about this more later, but I think that Tamara Hill Murphy has some good things to say and has maybe some valid criticisms to make, but I think that she mistakes Barrie's project in his fiction. I think she assumes that he's going for sort of straight realism in his fiction, and I don't think that's what he's going for.
I don't either.
We'll get to this in like 5 years probably, but his book about William Carlos Williams was really revelatory to me, just in terms of his aesthetic and his approach to literature, to writing literature. Imagination for him is very important. And he says that what he's trying to do in his poetry and in his fiction is to imagine the kind of world that could exist if people did live by love, right? And I think that's what's going here. I mean, I don't know if we could say that the story has a happy ending. Thad Coulter does kill himself, which is tragic.
Yeah,
profoundly tragic. Even though he's loved, he can't bear that love, and he kills himself. But the story does end in forgiveness, and I'm glad you brought that story up, John, about the Amish community, because this kind of thing does happen. It's not unrealistic, because it has happened and it does happen. Yeah. I mean, ultimately, this is a story about forgiveness, and so Andy's memory at the end is a memory of his grandfather's forgiveness that has allowed Andy to exist, right? If there had been a family feud between the Feltners and the Coulters and the Coulters, Andy would not have existed, right?
Yeah.
So
that's a great place to lead into. I'm really glad you mentioned that, and I think that's one thing that sort of takes the false polish off of this story or something, is Andy acknowledging that this story, this silence that was ringing in my ears my entire life, now that I understand it, now that I've heard this story for the first time, and he's not a young man at this point, or not a child at this point. Now that I've heard it, now that I understand it, the result is Andy having a greater appreciation for what he does have, not what he missed out on, or what he's lacking in not having not having been here. Because first of all, he exists, but also all this sort of domino effect that's come after that. It's kind of it's pretty fascinating bookends that don't make it very pretty, because at the beginning of the story he's come back to the farm and he's dealing with farm business, despite him having kind of like a different upbringing and being college educated and all of that. And then by the end of it, he has a greater appreciation for greater appreciation for the land where he came from and the history that it holds within it, and what led him to the place that he is right now.
Yeah. Well, is there anything in this story that we haven't got to that you guys wanted to make sure we covered? I mean, it's a long story. We haven't touched on all of it for sure.
I think the one thing that had stuck out to me that is kind of an entry in the greatest hits of Wendell Berry is that he does take a second in the story to mention what he calls one of the characteristic diseases of the 20th century, the suspicion that they would be greatly improved if they were someplace else. Right?
Yeah.
I thought that was just an interesting thing to point out, that he does take a second to point that out. Just this idea that Port William, the beginning of time, and this is very much a product of American history and the American dream. Just the idea that you can be anything you want, but if you want to be a movie star, you can't stay in Port William, or if you want to be a millionaire lawyer, you can't stay in Port William. And so he's acknowledging this idea of America that is eventually fractured communities because people grow up thinking, well, I can be anything, right? I'm going to grow up to be anything I want as long as I work hard. I can get it. It's the American dream, but it's this. But he refers to that as a disease because even if you go off and achieve that thing, whatever it is that you want, that there is something lost there. There's something broken. There's some sort of horror in living a carefree life and getting exactly what you want, when you want it, and how you want it. I just thought that line stuck out to me. That's one we hadn't talked about that I certainly wanted to mention.
Well, Tabby, you said you were reading the Great Gatsby right now, right?
And that was absolutely what I was thinking about.
Yeah.
As I was saying that, I'm teaching The Great Gatsby right now, and so that was that.
I mean, just
certainly.
those magnificent last lines of The Great Gatsby, like "So we beat on and bored back endlessly into the past."
Yes, absolutely.
That's an American problem that American writers keep pointing out, and we still can't.
We still can't figure out. We also can't figure out, what to do when a horse turd hits you in the eye and gives you a black eye.
Yes, a frozen horse turd.
Frozen horse turd. Yeah.
Thrown by a power of the air.
Yeah. So my second favorite quote from the story: in the previous winter, a young coulter by the name of Burley. Oh God, Burley, I love you. Burley had claimed that he had an eye blackened by a frozen horse turd thrown, so far as he could determine, by the power of air. Oh gosh, loved the little cameo from Burley Coulter. And when Matt was asking him if he'd seen anything interesting or heard anything interesting, I don't have the quote in front of me.
He had a knowing look and said yes, sir. Or something like that.
It's just like, of course I did. Yeah. I found all kinds of stuff out.
So Burley Coulter is comic relief even in this story.
Yeah, in a story that he only has like one line.
Yeah,
we can laugh about him getting himself into a situation that leads to him getting hit in the eye with a frozen horse turd. Yeah. And those are Wendell Berry's words, not mine.
Yeah.
Frozen horse turd. So, that's all I've got. You guys got anything else? I couldn't leave that one. That was a low-hanging fruit right there.
Yeah. John, anything else that struck you about this story before we close?
No, we covered most of what I had marked.
Yeah.
Great.
Makes me want more Jack.
Yeah.
I'll say that.
Yeah.
I look forward to talking about Memory of Old Jack. It's a fantastic book, and I mean we'll see him before then, of course, but it's a wonderful book.
Yeah, and already I'm struck already where like trying to get the Port William family trees straight. It's already getting confusing, but we'll give it our all. Thanks, friends, for listening to episode 7 of The Membership. In our next episode, we'll be discussing selections from Wendell Berry's 1969 collection of poems titled Findings, all of which you can find in the new collected poems. We hope you'll read along with us. The excerpts read in this episode can be found in That Distant Land or Fidelity, which were written by Wendell Berry and published by Counterpoint Press. If you like what you heard, please take a few minutes to rate and review us on iTunes. This helps others find the podcast. You can also connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at the handle MembershipPod, or find us online at membershippod.com. The Membership is a proud member of the Rabbit Room Podcast Network. To discover other great podcasts, visit rabbitroom.com/podcasts.